We're back. We're back talking about modifying the properties of materials. So we've already talked about degradation. How do materials degrade? Well, as a quick review, wood gets affected by water. It can rot and lose its strength. Metals get affected by water and can corrode, a lot of them. Ceramics can be affected by chemicals. Plastics are mostly affected by sunlight. The UV rays of the sunlight really break down the plastic, and we're not talking about composites for this stuff. So that's degradation. That's like, how does it lose its good properties that we like? How do those properties get worse with time? And then the next logical thing as intelligent human beings is, hey, how can we change those properties so that it's better? It resists the degradation. Okay, so let's look at it. So wood, these are pretty obvious. What do you do to protect wood? You need to protect it from the rain or water. Well, we might paint it. We might varnish it. Varnish is a paint that's clear, so it's the same thing. It just lets us see the beauty of the wood. We might treat it. There are some solutions that you can dip the water in, and basically that solution gets soaked into the water, and it's poisonous to bacteria and fungus and mold and that type of thing. Okay. Typically those solutions, they're a copper solution, so if you look at treated wood, technically it's called pressure treated wood. Usually it has slightly a greenish look to it. They've come up with another process, which is now it doesn't have that color. But if you were making fence posts, you would buy wood that is treated with a chemical so that the wood, even though it's in the wet dirt all year long, it doesn't rot. So we modify the property. How? By coating it with something, paint or varnish, or by soaking it with a copper solution or something like that, right? Okay. You can also heat the wood up, and that makes it more resistant too. Okay, ceramics. How can you protect ceramics? Well, ceramics, we already said, they can last thousands of years. They're actually really resistant. So they don't degrade much, not with sun, not with time, not with water so much. It's mostly with chemicals, with acids or bases. So how can we protect a ceramic? Well, and the other thing is, this pot, when I water it, the water just soaks through and this outside gets wet, so I have to keep watering it every day because it dries out really fast. Well, I can glaze it. It's kind of like a ceramic paint. I cover the ceramic. That makes it like a glass. I can put an acid in here, and in general, it should resist the acid, and the ceramic will be fine underneath. So glazing it, basically coating it, just like the wood, right? But we're coating it with a glassy type thing, okay? And like we said, these are great insulators, electrical insulators. Okay, how can we protect plastics? Well, we can add chemicals that resist the UV light, okay? You can coat it if you wanted to. I don't know if people really coat plastics that much. They can add antioxidants, so oxygen doesn't affect it so much. So that's basically the way you would protect these materials from degradation. You're basically improving the properties. And then the last one is metals. And metals gets a little bit interesting, okay? How can you change the properties of metals? Well, you can coat them with paint. We do that with our cars, for example. They're covered with paint so that they don't rust. Unfortunately, once you get a chip on your paint, you get a rust spot with time. Another thing is, what if I want a metal that is just a stronger metal? So if you think back in the day when people carried swords more often, those swords would have to be a very strong metal. Or if you talk about ships, the metal that they use to make the hull of the ship nowadays is so much stronger than the metal they used to use back in the day when the Titanic was around and all that, all those early ships. The metal wasn't as strong. So how can we make metal stronger? Well, it turns out, you've probably seen it in movies, you can take this metal, if you heat it up enough, and then you bring it up to a high temperature, and then you cool it down really fast. And the example I come up with is swords, because you've probably seen it. They put it in a bucket of water and you see the steam come off and everything. Okay, we call that quench hardening. They heat it up and then they quench it in the cold water, and it makes it very hard. That's one way to modify the property of a metal. You've made that metal much more rigid. Now the problem is, as you go and you make the metal stronger, like if this is a really strong and weak, you make it stronger, it becomes less resilient. So if you quench harden a sword, it becomes very hard, it doesn't bend, but it can, if you hit something, it can shatter easily. So then what they do is they heat it up again to a lower temperature, and they keep it at that temperature for a certain amount of time, and that makes it softer. Okay, quick thing about metals. So how can we modify the properties of metals? Well, there's first of all resistance to degradation. We might coat it with a paint. We might galvanize it, which is basically coating it with a metal that doesn't rust, doesn't corrode. So you may have seen some bolts for decks and stuff. They have sort of a grayish type metal over it. It's kind of rough. Those have been galvanized. They've been coated with another metal that doesn't rust. If the pieces are moving, for example, a bicycle chain, those pieces are moving. We can't really paint it so that it doesn't rust. What do? Well, we coat it with grease. Okay? And then there's a different type of modification of properties, which is when you want to make the metals harder or stronger. So for example, the steel that they take and mine and refine and so on typically isn't that strong. So what do metallurgists do? Well, they do something called quench hardening. Quench hardening basically means they heat it up to a really high temperature, and then they stick it in cold water or cold oil to cool it down really fast. You've probably seen it in some of these medieval movies where they're making swords and then they stick it in the water and you see the steam come up, right? So quench hardening makes it much harder. The problem is if you do that to a sword or for anything, it gets very hard, but it's not resilient. All of a sudden, if you take that sword and you hit something with it, it can shatter. So what do they do after that? They temper it. Tempering it means they take that cold piece of metal, you've already quench hardened it, it's very hard, but it can snap. So what do? We take it and we heat it up slowly to a lower temperature. We keep it at that temperature, at a very specific temperature, depending on how flexible you want the metal to be. How resilient do you want it to be? If you don't temper it, it'll be very brittle, it'll be kind of fragile, but it'll be hard. You won't be able to bend it. If you temper it in a certain way, if you temper it a lot, you can basically make it so that it can change its shape a lot and it won't be fragile, it won't shatter. For example, if I want to make a spring, well, I want elasticity for my spring, so I would temper it more to get rid of that hardness so that it can actually get deformed and take its original shape back. Okay, so those are some ways that we could modify the properties of metals, right? So I'm going to write how to modify these properties, okay? So it could be paint or varnish for wood. We could heat it, or we could use a copper solution to resist rotting. For metals, same thing, paint, galvanizing, which is kind of like covering it with another metal. We can do quench hardening to make it harder. And then after that, we would typically temper it, which means we make it way too hard, and then we make it the softness we want. And this is a really cool subject. It's really interesting how metallurgists work metal to get the right balance of properties they want. Ceramics, well, basically we coat it with paint or with an enamel or something like that. Plastics, you could coat it. Most of the time they put what we call additives, chemicals which resist oxidation or UV light. And we're going to leave composites. So basically, that's the idea. We modify the properties of materials to get what we want, to make it the way we want. And everything around you that has been designed by some humans, a lot of thought went into how can they make that material as good as we can for what we're using it. So the case of your cell phone, they've made it so that it's light,